Good evening, everybody. We're here for another edition of In the First, and I'm Jim Weldon, Rob Close, Chris Perenio.
How you doing?
As you can see, we have Dr. Stevenson here from the Caesar Rodney Institute, and we're going to be talking about energy and the environment. So, Dr. Stevenson, thanks for coming up here today.
Happy to be here. It's not actually doctor.
Okay, I always call you doctor. I know.
That's okay. A lot of people make that mistake,
Yeah.
but that's okay.
Yep. So, talking about those issues is very timely because as we talk about some of the issues that are hitting the country right now, devastating wildfires in California, amazing amount of loss. LA is burning. They don't have any capability of stopping it because they're suffering through 50 to 70 mile per hour winds. But the other thing, and having spent 20 some years helping with the volunteer fire departments, you actually need water to fight fire, and apparently they don't have water, which is going to be part of the land management issues we're talking about and some of the crazy policies that California has. So that's one of the big issues we're talking about. And the other interesting issue is President-elect Trump sent a team up to Greenland. Flying to Trump 1, and they're talking to the people of Greenland about joining the United States in some capacity, and there's a lot of interesting talk about that. A lot of people mocking it, but from a strategic sense, it makes a lot of sense. So.
Sounds like another Alaska.
It does. Sounds like another Alaska. Yeah, we can do another Alaska purchase, man. That'd be really great. So
it is funny how when you're living in the moment, the idea of merging countries and kind of changing political lines on the map seems so abstract. But in reality, throughout history,
it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Pull up a map of the world 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
It will not be the same as today. So
it's just not that unheard of.
It is not. It is not. And whether Canada becomes the 51st state or not, that'll be interesting also. But Pierre Trudeau has resigned, and the Canadians en masse were very excited to see him go. So we'll see what happens there. So, all right, take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm glad to be here. Family goes way back in Glasgow, so I'm close to my ancestors. A lot of them are buried at the old Presbyterian Church.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So glad to be here, and glad to be face to face. We do so much by Zoom. I do it too.
Yeah.
You just don't have the same interaction that you do face to face. So I'm really glad to be here.
And it's very cozy in our little room.
It is. It is.
Yeah, a little slow turning on the heat today, but
Right, yeah.
But now we're in this little pocket here, and we're doing great.
We are. We're getting better. Well, what's going to happen is as these podcasts go and people become really loving it and we expand, we will have a kind benefactor who will come in who will build us a nice new studio. So
Is his name Jim Weldon?
it is not.
Oh,
It is
okay.
not.
Oh, gosh.
It is someone to be named at a later date. So, and you know who you are. So we're just waiting for you to give us a call.
And I'll say thanks for making the drive up here.
Yes.
So for
Yeah.
all of our fans who are out there, just to show that this is all about in the first across the whole first state. Dave made the drive up from Lewis.
He did.
Just to do this
yes.
podcast. We're up here in Glasgow. For those of you who might not be familiar, might
Yep.
be joining for the first time.
And
So
I'm shocked. We had close to a foot of snow in Lewis, and I come off here, and I'm seeing inches.
Yeah.
I can see my grass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all
Through
we
the
got.
dusting. Yeah.
I spent the last 2 days, a couple hours a day, shoveling snow off my driveway. So feeling a little buff at the moment.
I think schools are still closed in Dover and that whole area.
Oh, wow.
Because the back
Yes.
roads are
Yeah,
still
we're
not-
still closed.
Yeah. There's some people who are still struggling to get out. So, it's one of those rare storms where the South got hit harder, and the band was a thin band, and the difference between 3 inches and 8 inches was not more than about 30 or 40 miles. So
they're talking about something similar for this weekend too.
they are, yeah.
More snow downstate,
More snow
upstate.
downstate. Yep. So we'll see. So
So
if we can-
what is the Caesar Rodney Institute? I think our
So it is a free market think tank when you get right down to it. It's been around for about 15 years. I've been with it for about 12. We look at state policies, and more recently, I've been working on federal policies, and we try to look at what's working, what isn't working, what might work better, and we recommend policies. We're going to be over in Dover in March, giving some suggestions to the legislature. We have 4 centers. One is on education, one is on health policy, one is just generally the economy and the state budget, and I run the Energy and Environment Center.
Yeah, we will be having Tanya come in later on. She's going to try to schedule her in February to come in and talk about the education component of it. And I feel bad because I am the vice chair of the Delaware Republican Party, and I see that the 3 members of our executive board, our treasurer Jean Trudeau, our secretary Brandon Bryce, and Michelle Parsons are all on the executive board of the Caesar Rodney Institute. So
It's really well done.
Yeah.
The folks we've got working there now are just outstanding.
Yeah,
they
fantastic.
really know what they're doing.
Yep.
And, unfortunately, we have to spend a lot of time opposing existing things, but we also get to recommend some really good new ideas.
yeah.
So, just to build on that a little more, you mentioned that you give policy suggestions and recommend ideas. You want to just dig into a couple off the top of your head, or?
Yeah, Tanya will give you the education speech, but on the energy and environment side, where we really want to be heading is towards nuclear, and with a backup possibly of doing carbon capture. Not the way people are thinking about carbon capture now. I've actually had an opportunity. I do some freelance consulting. Wound up working with a company called Cormatech in North Carolina. Some folks were taking that over, and they wanted to know whether the business was going to survive or not. They make filtration equipment for power plants to take out fine particle pollution, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, and they came up with a similar way to take out carbon dioxide. And it's much more efficient than other carbon capture technologies. And at the same time, our friends in Stanford and the University of Chicago have come up with catalysts that you take the carbon dioxide, turn it into ethanol and methanol, and all of a sudden you have a valuable product.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you can capture the carbon dioxide coming out of the power plant, say coal plant,
Right.
use that to now convert into more fuel. So no longer is it a byproduct.
Well, and it's not just fuel. These are ethanol and methanol and other products like that are precursors to almost anything we make. You want to make plastic, anything you make at a
Polymers.
chemical plant can come from this. So I'm looking at this. I go back to 1890 when gasoline was poured on the ground or into rivers to get rid of it as a waste
right.
product.
Rockefeller, right, making kerosene.
So what they would do is they would tune the refineries to minimize gasoline production and then throw it away. But then the combustion engine was invented, and all of a sudden, what was garbage is now valuable.
Oh, interesting.
So I see we are at the exact same spot with carbon dioxide. Rather than looking at it as something that's dangerous we need to get rid of, let's turn it into a useful product, and it'll be a free market-driven development. It's probably a bit away. It's at least 5 years away. But there's already companies that are starting to buy power plants just to get the carbon dioxide.
Interesting. So give us a little background. How'd you get into this?
Well, the Caesar Rodney Institute wasn't real old, but it was back in 2010, I think, is when I started. My wife was actually in the first Leadership Delaware class.
In the first.
And I because she was in that, I got involved. You didn't have any cost involved. It was free the first year. Now it's quite expensive to join it now. But what it does is over the course of a year, you take 2 days a week. I'm sorry, 2 days a month, and you have experts come in and talk about all kinds of policies, and it really gets these guys going. So not only did my wife participate, but I wound up making a donation, which was really funny because we had a meeting at Pete DuPont's house, and Terry brought us, he said, I want to bring up the donors that have helped make this possible. So here's Pete DuPont and Ernie DuPont and me. Now, I have to tell you, my donation was nowhere near theirs, of course, but I was up there anyway. But in the course was the guy that was the executive director at the time at Caesar Rodney Institute. I had just, I'm actually a serial entrepreneur. I've started 13 businesses, 7 for DuPont and 6 for my own, that my kids now run. So I had just turned over the last business to one of my kids, and I was looking for what's next. And so I wound up sitting in with Caesar Rodney Institute. At the very time, we were deciding what are the key things, what are these centers, what centers are we going to use? So we did a major analysis of what was hurting Delaware's economy. And it came up with the 4 centers that we had talked about. Well, now it's a matter of a coin toss. All right, which of us is going to take which center? Well, I actually, with DuPont, I was a tech manager, and I worked with DuPont. We were working with the federal government agencies who were trying to bring technology of solar power from space down to Earth. And DuPont offered a lot of the materials that needed to be in these solar panels, and also and how to actually turn it into a manufacturing process. And my specific involvement was in, we had a accelerated weathering capability that was beyond the normal accelerated weathering. In 6 months, we could tell if something was going to would last 25 years. So we did the testing on that because solar was so expensive when it was first came out. You needed 20 years to pay it back. So there had to be a 25-year warranty or nobody would buy it. Mm-hmm. Well, we were able to provide the data that said, yeah, you can write a 25-year warranty. I actually signed that document. So I've been interested in solar for a long time. We were also selling a product that was used in manufacturing wind turbine blades. So I was involved in that. And then I left DuPont and moved down to Lewis and started my own businesses. But I got very interested in temperature data. So I started looking at individual temperature stations and how the federal government, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, massaged that data. The data you see published is not raw data. It has been massaged 6 ways from Sunday. And in the year 2000, they changed the way they did the data. And I was one of the people that caught that change, still have the charts. So you look at the 1999 chart, and there is no trend of rising temperatures. You look at the way they changed how they massaged the data, and now all of a sudden there was an upward curve of temperatures.
How excuse me, how did they change the data?
Well, the primary thing they did, there used to be a correction for the data for what's called the urban heat island effect. When you have a city like Philadelphia, say, near us, the temperature can be 2, 3, 4 degrees higher because of the asphalt and the roofs and just everything packed together than if you were out in the country. So what happens is all these weather stations that go back into the late 1800s, a lot of them started out in farmland that now is in the center of Philadelphia, or Newark, for example. There's a nice station near the college. It's it's on the college property here, the University of Delaware, and it used to be very countrified. Now it's gotten some urban heat out of it. So they used to adjust for that. Well, they decided they didn't like what it did because when you adjusted for that, you got no climate change. And so they stopped using the urban heat island adjustments and used an averaging process that was also a problem because you wound up with, you would combine the data from, say, the Grand Canyon, which has since the weather station was built, has never seen any growth around it or any changes, a lot of these stations, we had one down in Milford that had been on 10 different farms over 100 years. And you had volunteers, the farmer was taking the data, a different farmer, different data. So they combined that, they averaged that with what's going on in Phoenix. And, 110 years ago, Phoenix was basically not there. And now all of a sudden it's a big city. So you're averaging that data. So a lot of things screwed up. Also, the quality of the weathering stations went way downhill. So there's standards for how these things have to be. And, for example, how much open space needs to be by it, and how high it is, and whether there's any trees next to it, and that kind of thing.
So as a percentage of the surface of the Earth that's covered by, let's say, cities, somebody may try to make the argument that, well, humans are expanding, and so these measurements are accurate because we've increased the size of our city and our developments in our towns. But overall, would you say
There's just not that much area.
yeah, percentage-wise, it's very small. So
Look at the election map and look at how many counties voted Democrat and how many voted conservative, Republican, and it's overwhelming, rural counties.
So it's a very similar overlay then. So this, we could argue, is not indicative of increased temperatures or people expanding out beyond the cities. The cities have grown slightly, encompass the farmland, and now the temperatures are way off. So do you have any ideas on how to get more accurate measurements? I mean, you were saying that Grand Canyon stable.
Yeah, look at
Or are there other
look
studies?
at Anthony Watts's website, and you'll find all the information you want. You'll also find out that 80% of the weather stations in the U.S. now are not meeting the qualities required for the weather stations. So, for example, you're supposed to have, I don't know the exact, it's just like 10 or 20 meters. It should be just grass around the station. Well, now you've got stations that used to be there, but now they've put a parking lot there, and maybe there's a building. I've seen them where the weather station is now up against a air conditioning compressor, which is giving off hot air.
Right.
So you've got Anthony Watts is the guy that, Dr. Anthony Watts is really the guy that has done the work on this. And, you can explain it. So I was messing with all this before I ever got connected with Caesar Rodney Institute. So I kind of became the natural guy to jump in and take the Energy and Environmental Center.
So you had mentioned two things. You had mentioned solar. You've done some work with solar, and you've also done some work with wind turbines, right?
Yes.
Now, obviously, the wind turbines was a big issue in Sussex County because of the desire to put the wind turbines out in the ocean, and there's been a fight down there. One of the
I may have been involved in
you may have been involved in that. That's true. One of the have you ever seen the series Landman?
Yes, we're watching that now. We're up to, I think, episode 5.
Yeah, it's a great. I'm a big Taylor Sheridan fan, and but that one scene, I think it went just ballistic, where he has the attorney with him, and they're by one of those big wind turbines, and he's talking about, this ain't green energy. So what's the issue with wind turbines?
Well, back in George W. Bush's presidency, we amended the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, which controls what happens in the oceans off of both coasts. And there was an authorization to begin building offshore wind that was allowed in that amendment. That amendment is very clear, that states you can put offshore wind out there, but it cannot unreasonably impact historic uses. So what are the historic uses? Commercial fishing, vessel traffic, and the view.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, would we put ugly turbines in the Grand Canyon? No. Why are we putting them right off the coast of every major tourist beach on the East Coast? So you've got that underlying issue in the law that allowed these. So now you get finally the final environmental impact statements from the government agencies, which includes the Bureau of Ocean Management, that is the major agency. They're getting advice from the National Marine Fisheries Service. They're getting advice from the Army Corps of Engineers. They're getting advice from the EPA. So they come out with their 1,000-page environmental impact statement. You start reading it, and they declare, well, it's so difficult for the fishermen to deal with the turbines, which are about a mile apart. They're going to abandon fishing in these lease areas. And then you find out, well, there's going to be more vessel collisions. And because the turbines are there, the Coast Guard is not going to be able to do the same search and rescue. And this has actually already happened. There's 5 turbines off of Nantucket. There was a boating accident, and a couple of people drowned because it took the Coast Guard so long to find them.
Right.
And so you've got vessel collisions, and even admitting in the impact statement, leading to more deaths, human deaths. And then you look at the turbine, the visual aspect, and it literally says it's going to be a major impact, that it's going to dominate the view from the cities. They have 6 levels of visual measurement. Dominate is the worst, and they will. Down in Ocean City and Fenwick Island, they're going to be 10 miles off the coast. And these things are, well, it depends on what they build. They originally talked about 12 megawatt turbines that are 853 feet tall. They're now talking 15 to 18 megawatt turbines, which get well over 1,000 feet tall. Put that in perspective. Have you ever driven down Route 1 over the Indian River Inlet Bridge?
Yeah.
Think about that bridge. The turbines are 4 times the height of that bridge.
Wow.
Wow.
And if you've looked at the cabling, next time you go by, drive by the cabling. From the beginning of the cabling to the end of the cabling is about how wide these turbine blades are.
Wow.
So you're looking at absolutely huge. Think about, when you're down at the beach, you see these container ships. These things are 4 or 5 times the height of those container ships. And the container ships are actually further away than the turbines will be.
So how effective is wind as far as the percentage of power that it can generate?
There we get into a great argument that most people underestimate. So what you'll hear right now from the industry is they are expecting, I've heard as low as 42%, as high as 46% capacity factor. They will produce energy that amount of the time. But then you go to our regional grid manager, PJM, and PJM looks at it and says, well, it's probably only going to be 37%. So why the difference? Well, the difference is we have 5 turbines off Nantucket, two off of Virginia Beach, and we have, on the Nantucket ones, we have about 6-7 years of data. And what it shows is the major energy production is in the spring and fall. When is the lowest electric demand? You don't have heating, you don't have air conditioning.
Spring and fall.
Spring and fall. So they're going to produce all this power, and you're talking about thousands of turbines up and down the East Coast. So the regional grid has already said there's going to be times we can't accept your power. It's called curtailment. So when you take, and it's already happened, by the way, in California and Texas. They've got so many onshore turbines that routinely you have to just turn these off. We can't accept the power. So when you consider curtailment, they're now looking at 37%.
And Stephanie, when she was on previously, had brought up the
Senator Stephanie Hansen.
sorry, yes, Senator Stephanie Hansen. Sorry, that storage. Delaware is actually looking into doing some battery storage. We don't currently have any capability of that.
Yeah, I just spent 2 hours on. I'm on Stephanie Hansen's energy advisory phone calls every 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. We actually had an extra one this morning talking about that very issue. So it's probably not going to be in the final program. What it looks like right now is we have convinced Senator Hansen that it's premature to have a bill that mandates this. So there's going to be a bill to study it. And part of that, they were going to set a goal of 500 megawatts of storage. So let's talk about what that means, because our audience, thank you very much,
Yeah, there's a bunch of topics here I want to come back to.
has no idea what a megawatt is. It's a million watts, basically. When you look at 500 watts, most of the batteries that are being bought are 4 hours. So that means you wind up with 2,000 megawatt hours of storage. Let's put that in perspective. In an hour in Delaware, we use about 1,300 megawatts. So you're not even getting 2 hours of storage with that 500 megawatts.
And I think most of the battery technology in the electrical grid right now is really used just to buffer peak loads or spikes.
Correct. There are some other uses for it. For example, in California, they have time of use rates, so you get more money for the power later when the sun goes down. So you put it into the battery, and then when the sun goes down, then you sell the electricity for more. We don't have time of use rates in Delaware right now.
So just to tie that back to all the windmills, spring and summer, the idea, or spring and fall when they're most productive and demands the least, the idea of storing that energy for use later, you get about 4 hours right now with the current.
Well, it's actually 2, but
yes.
when you actually look at total demand. So it's nothing. But what is the cost of it? Depends on who you talk to. I've seen numbers anywhere that 500 megawatts might cost $500 million to $1 billion. Put it in perspective, the total electric bill in the state of Delaware is $1.4 billion per year. So you're looking at huge numbers compared to what we have now. So you're going to see really high potential charges on electric rates because somebody's going to pay for this. It's either going to be subsidies from the taxpayer, which is part of it, and then it's going to be subsidies from electric customers.
So if I may, let's rewind because this is probably a pretty new topic for a lot of the people who are listening. So
yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's all right. We've covered a lot of ground here. This is good. So we talked about like the size of turbines they might install, and you talked about 12, 15, maybe 18 megawatts. So just so people understand, under the right conditions, the right airspeed at the right direction, everything's working great. That turbine will produce about 12 megawatts or 15 or 18, depending on the size of it.
Megawatt hours per hour.
Per hour, correct. Okay. Right. And then, excuse me, sorry.
And by the way, that's about what a residential customer uses in a year.
Okay. So one turbine.
A 12 megawatt turbine in 1 hour would produce about what a residential customer would use in a year.
Under the right conditions.
Under the right conditions.
And what you mentioned, what you mentioned earlier is that the estimate is 37%, which just for easy round numbers, you have a windmill that puts off, let's say 10 megawatt hours, 37% throughout the year, right? We'll say the year. So you're getting 3.7 megawatts, which is way less than half.
Right.
So.
And then you have to take into effect these things age, and they get less efficient with age.
Right, and the wind doesn't blow, and the wind doesn't blow under the right circumstances, or they got to do maintenance, and all of that factors into.
Yeah, in Germany, about a month ago, there was almost a 1 month period where there was almost no wind and no sunlight, and they're really depending on wind and solar.
Yeah. We'll get back to Germany because I know you got a couple other questions.
Right. Yeah.
Germany's an interesting topic.
So one of the things I think is important for people to understand is when you factor in 37% or so, let's call it a third, rough math. You can't just build enough wind turbines to produce the X amount of power that we need. You would need 3 times as many. But then even on top of that, there's a timing issue. There's a storage issue. Even the storage issue might be I'm making power right now and it's in a battery, but you're talking about making power in the spring and I need it in the summer.
The battery is not going to work that long.
Right, exactly, right? So this is more, if I understand you right, and for, again, people watching, the wind is great at night. We can put it into a battery and it helps during the next day. but just because the wind is great in April, it's not going to help us in July.
So, yes, so you've got this problem. So we go back to our regional grid manager, PJM. They have been putting out information recently, as other regional grids have been doing, is that we are about to fall off a reliability cliff. So what that means is baseload power plants like coal plants, natural gas plants, nuclear plants, that you can schedule when they run and run most of the time. They are closing at a very high rate and not being replaced. So if you look at PJM, I'm going to give you some numbers. Right now PJM has about 185 gigawatts, that's billion watts of generating capacity. 40 gigawatts of that is about to close. And we need that. We can't survive with that. So you've got to have replacements. So what's in they call it the queue. What's in the queue to replace that? Well, it's all wind and solar. So the first thing PJM says, well, because of these low capacity factors, you've got to build 3 times as much wind and solar as that coal plant you're shutting down. Secondly, because of some quirks in the ability to get all the permits to build a project like U.S. Wind is running into, there are companies that all they do is try to get projects approved, and then they sell them for somebody else to build. So they'll put in 5, 10 projects when they only want to build 1. So they get these approvals, and then they don't build it. In fact, what the number PJM uses is 5% of the projects that are wind and solar projects will all that gets built. And then you take this 3-to-1 factor, and there is not enough in the queue to replace with wind and solar what you're going to lose from these plants closing. Like the Indian River Power Plant, coal plant in Billsboro, is supposed to close in the next 2 months. So,
Originally scheduled that it would, I mean, it has a lifetime that's probably another decade or so. It was originally then scheduled another year or 2.
Yeah, 10 to 20 years lifespan left, yeah.
Yeah. And then it was scheduled, I think, to close in 26, and now they've accelerated that until next month.
Yeah, and the reason for that is you have to have very narrow control of the voltage. And if it's even a little bit off, you're going to ruin your computer or ruin your generators or your industrial equipment. And there was a problem if that plant closed with maintaining the reliability of that voltage. And to do that, there was an improvement made in the transmission system that they thought was going to take 5 years. It got done in 3. So that's why it's closing early.
Are they incentivized to close it early?
No. NRG, literally NRG, owns that plant. Back when, in the early aughts, when we decided to stop having utilities own the power generating facilities, the plants all got sold. And NRG decided to buy coal-fired power plants. And Calpine decided to buy natural gas. Well, natural gas is taken over, and coal is not doing very well. NRG only has, between Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, a handful of remaining plants, and it looks like they just want to exit.
Probably something to do with ESG scores and government.
Yeah, could be any. I'm not privy to why they're closing them, but there's. They just closed the biggest coal burning plant in Pennsylvania. They've closed 5 plants in Maryland, and they're closing their last plant in Delaware. And a year or 2 ago, they closed their last plant in New Jersey. So they just seem to be exiting the market.
So, Chris, was there more you wanted to hit on this? Because I want to.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I
Okay.
appreciate it. I would just wanted to level set with folks
Yeah.
because it's probably pretty new to a lot of people.
It is. So, just to make it very simplified, we're losing the little coal production that we have, and the answer is that we're going to use either solar or wind. And right now we're just focusing on the wind. And the problem with the wind is that you cannot produce enough wind turbines to sustain the enough energy that we need to support the demands in this state for an entire year. One of the big reasons is wind turbines only work when the wind blows, and the wind blows more in the spring and more in the fall and doesn't blow in the summer. We all know that. And so therefore, even if you could produce all the energy that you thought you needed just with the wind turbines, it would only support the demands in the fall and in the spring. It would not support anything during the summer, and there's no capacity currently to be able to store it. Is that
Correct. And you've got, think about the coldest nights. They're not the windy nights.
they're not?
Think about the hottest days. There's often no wind.
So, I mean, three guys sitting here in a room with you hearing this, like we can kind of come to the understanding of the situation pretty clearly. Why then are we still, as a nation, as a state, moving in this direction?
That's the bigger question.
Yes.
I wanted to get to.
Yeah, okay.
If we can put, in my mind, we're going to get to that point.
Okay.
So, but the beauty of wind is that it doesn't create any pollution.
The wind does not. Just leave it alone. But when you
Wind
put
turbines, they're pollution free, correct?
no, that's not the case.
Why is that not
you,
correct, the
you
case?
have to manufacture them, number one. And so you've got impacts going there. If you decide to build batteries, there's a huge amount of carbon dioxide put out to mine the materials, build the batteries, and get them in place. For example, just to take a quick side note on electric vehicles, because there's a lot of talk about
Yeah, we'll be getting to that. Yeah.
savings. But what you can do is you can measure the cradle to grave emissions of a battery, and compared to a gas powered car, and it takes you've got about an 8-year lifespan for the battery, but it takes about half that time to make back the carbon dioxide you emitted when you were building the battery and mining the right. So you've got that going on if you're going to have storage. You've got a similar thing going on building the turbines. But environment doesn't just involve emissions.
Correct.
What's it doing to the marine life? What's it doing, particularly to threatened species?
Mm-hmm.
You've got issues with if you're stopping fishing. What are you going to do for food security and reasonably priced food?
Mm-hmm. And then what is the average cost to produce the energy from these wind turbines as compared to let's say natural gas, for instance?
Well, there's a couple ways of looking at it. You can what pro-wind folks like to do is they want to look at the direct cost for building that turbine, getting the power ashore, and the U.S. Energy Information Agency has something called their annual levelized cost of power estimate.
Mm-hmm. And
the latest one, I think I just looked at this morning, they're saying the power would cost $134 per megawatt hour. Again, megawatt hour is what your residents using in 1 month. So it'd be $131. Compare that to natural gas. A new natural gas plant would be $40 instead of $131.
Okay, so that dramatically increases the price of energy for our consumers. Not just us as residential, but for any company that wants to come in and work here in Delaware, because one of the things they really would like to have is cheap energy. Is that correct?
That's correct. And in fact, you bring up an excellent point. What has happened in Delaware, we used to have a lot of energy-intensive businesses.
We did.
We had a steel mill. We had chemical plants. We had auto manufacturing plants. all those have left. We have literally the industrial use of energy has dropped by 60%. And that is all related to energy intensive companies leaving the state. Those are the people that are getting paid $80,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
They're high-paying jobs. They're not, restaurant jobs, and that's been a major loss to the state economically.
Did those energy-intensive companies leave because of grid issues in Delaware, availability of power, cost of power?
No cost of power and the tax situation. Delaware, Delaware has the second or third highest corporate tax for a business that's operating here. You've not only got it's over, I think it's 7.5% now, income tax. You've also got the gross receipts tax, which adds another 3 or 4% to the cost. And by the way, whether you're in a recession and losing money, you still pay the gross receipts tax. So we looked at the steel mill. I looked carefully at that when Claymont Steel shut down. They refused to answer why they left. But they had 3 plants and only needed 2. So one of the plants was in Portland, one was in Saskatchewan, Canada. And started looking into the details. So I looked at the power cost, and I looked at the taxes that were being paid in those 3 locations, and Delaware was by far the highest.
Right.
You might think of Oregon being, expensive West Coast state, but Oregon in particular gets almost all of its electricity from hydropower, which is very cheap, and the dams were built, many decades ago and been paid for. So between taxes and electric prices, that's why they've left, and other companies are not going to locate here.
Right. Yeah.
We would love to have a data center here, or
Sure,
an
we
AI
would.
center, or a Bitcoin mining company, but why would they locate here with a high? One of the biggest expenses is electricity.
Yeah.
For all.
Rob, you didn't
it's-
even put him up to that.
Yeah. No, we just,
Yeah.
AI is his big.
that's my big issue, and he's in the IT field, so we cannot attract companies to the state because we don't have our energy costs are too high. There's other factors, but energy costs are too high, and we don't have the capability of producing it because we don't really produce any of our own energy. We buy it, and if we have to buy it, it's more expensive than if we produce it on our own.
Yes, let me put a number to that. As recently as 2016, we produced almost 80% of the electricity in state. This current year, we've done half that. We're around 40%.
Wow. And it's going to,
And that's been driven because of carbon taxes that we can get into.
right.
So when we did produce our own power, was that primarily Indian River?
No, it's a combination. Indian Rivers were certainly contributing, but it was more natural gas. Something like 95% of the power generated in Delaware is natural gas, and it's primarily a lot of the plants are just up here, Edgemore,
Right.
and then around Dover there's some power plants
Yeah.
Where do we get the natural gas? Like, do we import it?
from Louisiana.
Oh, interesting.
So it comes all the way up.
So we have to import it from a foreign country.
We could be, you're talking thousands of miles. About 2 years ago, there was a pipeline problem and we were in trouble.
Yeah.
There's been talk about we only need a fairly short connector to connect to the Pennsylvania Marcellus fields. But right now, we have no way to tap into the local, and it would save money if we could. Delaware actually pays more for natural gas than most states.
Right. So, we're saying that wind is just not going to cover what we need. It's very expensive. It only works when the wind blows, and the wind blows at a time we probably have our lowest energy needs.
Yeah, and we were talking about the expense of wind, and you alluded to, you talked about
so,
130, 135.
Yeah, so let's go
But it-
back to that.
It seemed
Yeah.
like maybe there was a little bit more to that.
Right.
Yeah, so remember, when you actually compare these, you have to add the fact I've got to build 3 times as much offshore wind as if I built a natural gas plant. Plus, wind is generally, even this offshore wind, there was a consultant for the Maryland Public Service Commission when they were approving these wind projects who said, you really ought to be building these on land rather than the ocean.
Right.
And in fact, you're going to have more carbon dioxide emissions to build it offshore than on land. And the reason for that is you've got to move the power further on a transmission line. Every foot you go down a transmission line, you're losing power. You're not supposed to do this, folks, and don't tell anybody I told you this, but you could actually take one of those old metal mattress frames and put it near a transmission line and put two lines to it, and you can steal power. Because all that power is being lost.
Don't do this at home.
Do not try
Don't
this
do
out.
this at home.
Magnetic fields are on the
The
wires.
magnetic fields are maintained by, it's just a natural part of physics.
Right.
And so the further you move, the more you lose. And then also, there's a huge congestion problem near York, Pennsylvania. So most of our power that we import is out in Pennsylvania. And it comes through this York, Pennsylvania congestion point that just there's a transmission shortage. And we pay a congestion charge. So the more when we bring power, we're wasting emissions, we're wasting power, and we're getting congestion charges. So all that's a problem. So all these projects, the fact that offshore wind is at the very edge of the regional grid means you're going to have to build new transmission lines.
Right.
And you have to add that cost. And there are some other costs that come in. So when a recent study was done, it was published in Real Clear Energy this morning, the staggering cost of New England electricity. I think there's a few more words in there, but it came up to, I believe it was $434 or $436 per megawatt hour when you throw all of the real costs in.
As composed to how much for natural gas?
40.
That's a little higher.
Just a little.
Yeah.
And it's even higher than, somewhat higher than onshore and offshore wind.
Okay.
And these, the New England study that you referred to, isn't just people's kind of pie in the sky estimates about something that could be way in the future. They're actually dealing with this right now because they've installed wind turbines off of, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, I believe.
Yeah.
Right? So these are real life, in the moment issues, dollars, quantities that they're dealing with.
Yeah, they've approved a lot of projects. But it's just going to be really expensive. It was also included some battery storage. So when you throw all that in, you get these 4 times the cost of what the U.S. Energy Information Agency estimate is.
And just last point on that one, those projects that they've installed, how many wind turbines are there roughly off of Nantucket? Do you have a sense?
I think it's 89 to be precise. But that's only the first. There are actually 6 lease areas just south of Nantucket. There's probably, I think there's going to be 300 or 400.
Gotcha. All right. So for people at home, 300 or 400 in these lease areas off of Massachusetts or Rhode Island. In this report, they talk about in order to meet the goals and projections that they're talking about, New England will need between onshore and offshore turbines, they'll need about 11,000.
Yeah, so it's interesting in New England. I lived up there for 8 years. You've got Massachusetts that doesn't want to build anything anywhere. So they have a great renewable portfolio standard, which means the utilities have to buy a certain amount of wind and solar power. Well, I'm sorry, but New England's not a great place for solar power. You don't get as much sunlight, particularly in the winter. But they also don't want to build any wind turbines. They've got a couple of nice rivers up running through Massachusetts, but they won't put a dam up. They had a nuclear plant and closed it. Vermont had a nuclear plant and closed it. So they're getting rid of power. So the Massachusetts is meeting the wind requirement by turbines that are built at the northern tip of Maine because they don't want to build them in state.
So
it's a bunch of.
So let's talk about solar because it seems, based upon our discussion, that clearly is the way to go. Because if you have some wind, but the beauty about solar is that the sun is up, and the sun is up a lot in the summer, and that's when we have a higher demand. So solar seems to be the answer.
Well, you have a peak demand that occurs in the summer, and it tends to be around 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the evening when people come home, turn the air conditioner on, start doing all your life.
That's a little
And that's
of a problem.
the solar,
Okay.
sunlight most of the power from a solar project comes between like 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
But your batteries
And
can
it
store
starts to
that,
fall off.
correct?
Yeah, we're paid that $500 million for batteries. Yeah, that'll do it.
Oh, half a
2
billion.
hours.
Half,
2 hours.
Yeah,
oh, only for 2 hours.
here's a number you may find interesting. So we've had a renewable portfolio state a mandate to buy wind and solar power in Delaware for 20 years. In 2025, the requirement is 25% of our power has to come from wind and solar power.
Mm-hmm.
In state, we are generating just over 1% after 20 years with solar.
Yeah, Senator Hansen mentioned that figure, which prompted some questions from me. But is it just because we haven't put enough effort into it? Why? I mean,
I don't have the exact number, but it's in the range of between $100 and $121 million added to electric bills every year right now, and we're still spending more going forward. Plus what we lost from taxes. We've increased electric rates $100 to $120 million, subsidizing. This is electric customers subsidizing solar
right.
to get 1% of our power.
Yeah, we did spend some time talking about the subsidizing of the electric. So,
And based on what you said earlier, that's about 10% of our power bill.
10% of our electric bill for 1% of our power.
so tell me. I thought maybe because when you said it was the summer and all that, I thought I had the answer. It looks like I don't. But why isn't solar going to be the answer for this? I mean, it can provide some of it, apparently at a great cost. But why isn't solar the silver bullet?
Well, the price was coming down for a while, but the prices actually started going the other way. So 2 years ago, we talked about $40 a megawatt hour for natural gas, new natural gas. Solar was down around that number. It's now, we're now seeing prices around 55. And I recently heard from a project, I won't tell the source, but they were looking at 75. So the price of solar is actually going up, same with wind. And
Why did that price go up?
material cost inflation has affected solar more than and wind more than other issues.
Okay, and the cost of and again, solar does produce some type of an impact to the ecology. The production of the solar cells, what's required to do that?
Well, you need a lot of metals, rare metals, and China controls most of that. So you see these pictures and they're real. You go to the Congo, which is one of the major sources for some of these chemicals, and you've got children working in these surface mines, digging it out for pennies a day. The Chinese are buying it all, sending it to China where it is refined. And you look at the pollution coming out of the refinement processes, it's horrible. And some of the manufacturing of solar panels was done in parts of China where there is slave labor.
Okay.
So you've got a lot of bad issues going on. We really should be doing these things in the U.S. if we really want to do them. We actually started doing most of the solar manufacturing right here in the U.S. We even had a great Astro Solar in Delaware was one of the leaders.
So a lot of the emphasis, apparently, from what I can tell, the emphasis has been on not commercial, but on residential. The state has subsidized at I would say, pretty high cost of
three times the cost of utility scale.
Okay, 3 times. That's a lot for homes to put solar panels on, and a lot of people have done it. I go into my neighborhood. There's a lot that's there, but it barely scratches the surface. That's not going to answer the question about producing the energy we need for industry or for data centers to come in. Correct. Because it's just
not going to happen.
It's not feasible to do it at this time.
You generate half the power in the winter that you do in the summer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I did notice in the wintertime the sun's not out as much.
Yeah, and that lower angle.
Yeah, they've not a great
plays a big part.
Yeah, and so people don't always appreciate that fact. The sun's out, and that's it.
And right now, a lot of the panels are covered with snow.
Yeah, true. Which is
Particularly down south, you guys got it easy up here.
yeah, we got it easy. We got it easy. So solar is not going to be the answer. And the other problem that we have is that because we had this major push, and because the state has decided that we want to be a California East, that we have made the decision that we're going to mandate electric vehicles, which is going to create an even higher burden on our electrical needs. You want to talk about that?
Sure, because what was it? It's been almost 2 years now. I did a series of presentations, including one
Right here?
Right here. Not,
Yep.
I don't know if it was
Yeah,
in this
right here.
building. Was it in
Yeah.
this building? And we talked about the problems with EVs and having this mandate. So in Delaware, what we came out with a mandate was that the 2027 model year, which is 2 calendar years away, comes out in the mid-year, auto dealers must have on their lots 43% of the vehicles have to be full battery electric vehicles. This year, 9% of the cars bought in the state were electric vehicles. So you tell me how we're going to go from 9% now and falling, by the way. It's actually the rate of sales is falling compared to gas hybrid vehicles. And how you're going to get from 9% to 43% in 2 years. It's not going to happen.
Well, and the other challenge is that Toyota and Ford have both pulled back on their production because they're losing money on it.
And the rest will as well.
Okay.
And battery plants that we've started building, some of them will not get built.
So when you buy an electric vehicle, right? You know, Tesla. I love Tesla. Great company, and
The cars are great.
yeah. I mean, it's really cool. If you were a terrorist, don't use the Cybertruck as a vehicle borne in improvised explosive device because it's so good it contains it. But at any rate, so I buy it now. I have it, and then I can just get like an extension cord and run it in. Or what's the cost that I have to have at my home in order to be able to charge that?
Well, it's going to be, I think it's around $1,500 to put it in your house.
Okay.
There is a state subsidy available. It covers a good part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great. I got a garage.
Mm-hmm.
I got a driveway. I could do that in a heartbeat.
Sure.
How about all these people in Wilmington,
Yeah. How about that?
West Center City?
Yeah.
They don't have driveways.
They don't have.
They don't have garages.
What do you if you live in an apartment complex?
You can't guarantee that you go home and you're going to find a spot in front of your house.
Right.
So yeah, literally in Wilmington, you would have to put a charging station at every parking space.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for that? Nobody's going to pay for that.
Right. So that is an added cost to the total production, correct?
Yeah. Plus, in-home charging is about a third the cost of using public charging.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to have one of these cars, if you want it to be competitive with gasoline, you've got to charge it at home overnight. The chargers overnight can take 6, 7, 8 hours to fill the battery. If you go to a Wawa or Royal Farms, you can do it in you can get about half the charge in 20 minutes, and you pay about 25 cents a kilowatt hour, which is about twice what you pay at home. But if you stay at one of those Tesla chargers, the price keeps going up the longer you park there. They don't want you parking there longer than 20 minutes.
Oh, interesting.
There is a factor around 80% of battery capacity. They kind of figure that you're good enough at that point, so why don't you move along? You know, you can stay and charge to 100% if you want,
Right.
but it's gonna, they encourage you at 80%.
Okay.
And the Wawas and Royal Farms love it because you're sitting there with nothing to do, so you go in and buy stuff.
So what I've found over the years is that batteries don't seem to work as efficiently when they're cold in the wintertime.
Yeah, correct. There's different numbers. Apparently, depending on the manufacturer, and I don't have all the details, but some of the batteries are a little better than others and don't do as poorly in the cold as others. But you're probably looking on average, maybe you lose 20% of the capacity in the cold. You can also lose it in the heat. And and then you've got the lifespan problem.
Mm-hmm.
So
What is the lifespan problem?
Well, it's basically on the number of chargers you do. Think about your cell phone. Most people don't realize it, but the more often you charge your cell phone, the faster the battery will die.
Mm-hmm.
and the actual average that is used for EVs is 2,500 charges, which is about 8 years.
Right.
And at that point, you're going to have to replace. So you got to be really careful about buying a used EV, because you're looking at $15,000 to $20,000 to replace the battery. So you go buy this used Tesla that's 6 years old, and and you get a great price on it. And a year or two, you need to spend 20 grand on a battery.
Well, in fairness, it's similar to any car, though. It depends on your driving habits, right? So if you don't drive a lot and you only charge that car once a week, the battery will last a lot longer than 8 years.
Sure.
Right. But
Yeah, in fact, there's a statistic on that. Most EVs are second vehicles, and they are only used about 60% as much as a gas-powered car. on
Interesting.
average.
Yeah.
So, solar doesn't seem to be our silver bullet either, right? So, going back to your question, why? Why are we going through this massive cost increase?
I have just a little bit to build on that.
Oh,
Yes, please do.
So we have, I think what is happening here anyways, we've articulated a bunch of problems with this new initiative to move towards what they call a greener source of energy. Because we feel coal, natural gas, even nuclear, I think, they're shutting down, are damaging our environment, which I think there is some pollution aspect to it. There's a lot of controversy over, like we spoke about, with temperature increases due to how do we measure the temperature increases. But I get the feeling that the powers that be that are making these decisions to push these agendas they understand our current usage of energy, and they're pushing this agenda to almost change that core feature. So people in a city needing individual chargers for every parking spot, hugely expensive. So my assumption is that they're thinking people are just not going to own cars in cities anymore. People using energy during the peak times when everybody wants to cool their house or heat their house in the winter. I think the idea is, well, turn your thermostat up or turn it down. Stop living like you're living now. We need to change our behavior as humans to save the environment, which there's a lot of controversy over whether we're hurting the environment or not. And the way they're incentivizing us to do that is by drastically increasing our costs for energy. So it feels to me like this is a very purposeful movement from the group pushing these agendas, and they're forcing us into it by these costs, and they're doing it on purpose. And I'm not fully sold that the motives are to save the planet. But, I mean, we can kind of dig into that. I said a few things there, but...
I think you're very perceptive, because I've seen the same thing. When you look at the Delaware assumptions, they are expecting fewer people to drive. They are saying, well, we're going to make more sidewalks, and we're going to make more bike lanes, and we're going to make more buses. So if you're poor living in Wilmington, don't buy a car. You're just going to use other modes of transportation, which I can't see and wouldn't want to see people walking in the cold and the snow in the winter because they don't have any other way to get there, and the buses stopped running because of the snow. But that is the underlying motive. It is to force us to change, to use cars less, to buy cars less. There was an idea in France. I don't think it's going anywhere, but you were only going to be allowed to fly an airplane twice in your life. So the idea, you can go to Baku, Azerbaijan for the UN conference, and there'll be 5,000 private jets to get folks there. But you, as an individual, you better not do that. You can't even use a commercial jet. You just need enough fly. So that really is the bottom line. If you look at the actual situation we've got, Delaware now meets every air quality standard from the EPA, and we meet it easily. And those standards are set based on health issues. So if you got a standard for a particular air pollution and you're meeting it, it's not going to have doing better is not going to make people any healthier. We've actually, by improving, for example, in automobiles, have reduced air pollution by 90%. And it would be higher, but people are keeping cars longer, so some of the older polluting cars are still on the road. But as those go out, we're going to wind up seeing air pollution 95% reduction from automobiles. So we don't have a health issue. You can make the case of CO2. The Environmental Protection Agency came up with a formula called the MAGIC formula with 2 C's. You can calculate CO2 emissions reductions, and it tells you how much global temperatures will drop. If Delaware went to 0 tons from all sources, we would save 4/100ths of a degree. We have no impact.
And that's not even taking into account what we've seen recently with the greening of the planet. The higher CO2 levels are actually making vegetation greener and use more CO2 and more healthy. So
yeah, over the geologic time, CO2 has averaged about 2,000 parts per million, and we're currently at 420. At 150, all plants would die. So they have to have carbon dioxide. In Germany, or if in Europe particularly, they do it a little bit in the U.S., but more in Europe, you have a greenhouse operation where you're growing food. They will pump extra CO2 to make the plants grow faster. Typically, it'll be between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million, where 420 is outdoors. And if you think, well, isn't that CO2 dangerous? A typical CO2 level on a submarine is 5,000.
but it could
I
heat
can
the planet. Yeah.
In fact, if you go to an indoor concert, you're probably at 2,000 or 3,000 in the auditorium.
Right.
But the argument there is that it's not humans breathing it. That's the problem. It's the greenhouse effect of the CO2 in the atmosphere heating the planet.
Well, okay. So we talked about land-based temperature measurements are crappy at this point. One of the reasons is, as recently as 2 decades ago, we had like 6,000 worldwide measuring stations. We're now down to 2,500. They've closed 2,000 in the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union fell apart, and we've closed them rest around, most of our temperature is being measured by a very small part. So what we need to do is we use satellite data. Satellite data is global. And that satellite data shows that, unfortunately, the satellite first one went up in 79. So our data only goes back that far. But from that point, temperatures have increased 1.3 degrees centigrade. The problem is the coldest decade in the last 100 years was the 1970s. So there is cyclical rises and falling of temperatures over decade periods. And so you don't know how much of that 1.3 degrees is actually a problem. In fact, two NASA engineers just released a study, and I don't know the name of it. I can send it to you. That said the reason the 70s was so cold is because there was so much smog and particle soot, basically, in the atmosphere. It was blocking the sun. We have gotten so much cleaner, we don't have that same blockage anymore, and most of that 1.3 degrees is accounted for in that, not in CO2. Another way to think about it, CO2 has increased 30-some% since the 70s, and temperatures have only gone, absolute temperatures have only gone up about 1%.
If we're even measuring correctly.
Well, I'm taking absolute zero.
So how could we, I guess, look at something else to determine whether or not the planet is rising? I think the polar ice caps, right? They reference that a lot. Have we seen the polar ice caps melting, or?
Again, it's cyclical in the Arctic, particularly in Antarctica. The ice averages come and go a little bit when it's ice just over the ocean rather than over the land. But for the large part, Antarctica has seen no change from climate change.
But the sea level is rising everywhere. Everything's getting flooded because of the sea level rise. Isn't that true?
We-
Which
we
would
have-
be an indication of melting polar caps.
It would, yeah.
Well, we have good data from tide gauges for the globe going back to 1850. And what we've seen,
Clearly, it's got to show something.
well, I'll give you the data. I wish I had the chart with me. It has been averaging 7 inches of sea level rise per century. 7 inches per century. There is some evidence that may have gone up 1 or 2 inches in the last couple of decades, but again, there's a certain amount of cyclicalness of it
Right.
that it may not be a true increase. So, and sea level rise is what DENREC uses all the time.
They do all the time.
So the UN group that does all this climate change information, they have a series of models, and one of the models they call the business as usual model, and it shows that we're going to have 5 feet of sea level rise by 2100. The UN itself has thrown that model out as being unlikely, impossible to hit. The annual report they do, what they're using right now, is sea level rise might rise between 9 inches and 24 inches. And the 9 inches would be basically what we would expect based on historic data, and 24 inches would be more. But there is absolutely no evidence showing we're going anywhere near that 24-inch number.
Okay.
Certainly not 5 feet.
All right.
That,
But
that's fear-mongering.
all right. No. I got it now. Our storms are much worse now, and it's all because of climate change. That's got to be true.
Talk to David Legates. Have him on if you haven't already.
No, we
Sounds like
will.
a topic for another
And the
podcast.
reality is,
There is absolutely, even the UN, there is a little bit of data that besides warming, a little bit of data on sea level rise, but as far as increases in hurricanes frequency or power, tornadoes, none of that is true. There was a fear story that came out in Delaware for a local story that thunderstorms were coming more frequently. So we were getting these big, you can get, I once had hit, I lived in Bellevue Manor. We had 10 inches in an hour in this one storm. So all of a sudden, the data for Newcastle County went up out of sight about the frequency of these storms. So David started looking at it. So the primary weather station they're using is Wilmington Airport. But there was a second one, the Porter Reservoir, which is up on north end near the Delaware River. Was getting these high storm rates too. So there's a volunteer up there that does the measurements. So David went and interviewed him. It turns out, if it was really raining hard, the guy that just took the data from the Wilmington Airport and didn't look at his own rain gauge. So you get situations like that. You really have to be careful what you're doing.
Yeah. So
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think what we're getting at here is there is a lot of scientific controversy over whether or not we are actually, due to our energy usages from natural gas, coal, natural resources, are actually having that dramatic of a negative effect on our environment to the point that we need to take these drastic measures to greatly increase our cost of energy to avert this problem that may or may not exist.
Exactly. So for Delaware in specific, since we don't have onshore capacity and solar is growing so slowly, it would actually, to meet the goals, it would have to be 28 times faster than the last 20 years in 5 years, which is not going to happen. So they were looking at offshore wind because that was something that would be a large number in a short period of time. But that short period of time, you've got U.S. Wind is renegotiating their project with the Maryland Public Service Commission. And in the documents they submitted, they're not expecting, they're going to do the first part of the project, a quarter of the project, and they may have it operational by 2029. And the rest of the project won't be till 2030 or 31. That's about the same time small modular nuclear reactors are going to kick in. It's going to take a little while to build them, but by the 2030s, you're going to see nuclear plants being built everywhere. We're seeing a real nuclear renaissance right now, and we can go into more of the details of that. But all of a sudden, things are starting to look good for nuclear power.
But Dave, in the meantime, we're going to need energy later this year, next year. How long would it take to get a natural gas plant in place?
With permitting and everything, it might take 2 or 3 years.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And we have plenty of natural gas because we're not using as much. I mean, the number one thing you want to do is simply get the existing natural gas plants working at their usual 75%. Instead, right now they're operating at about 35%. And the reason for that is Delaware came up with a tax on carbon dioxide. It's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So the natural gas plant has to go and buy a allowance for each ton of CO2 they emit. So it used to be real cheap. You could buy at the auction. You might get an allowance for $3. So a natural gas plant has about 4/10 of a ton. So $3 times 4/10 was $1.20 added to your bid into the regional grid to sell power. So you'd win enough bids, you'd produce power. Like back in 2016, we did 80% of our power. Now, however, the cost is up to $20 a ton. So you're now adding the wholesale price, by the way, in the regional grid that they're competing against is around $30 a megawatt hour. So now you're adding $8 to your bid. Everybody else is bidding 30. You're bidding 38. You're not winning a lot of bids.
No. Yeah.
So we have to get rid of the carbon tax. And another reason to get rid of it, it used to be, it's not really an auction. They have an auction, a quarterly auction. And it's not really an auction anymore because the guys that run the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative have created a base price and a maximum price. And what they do is, if the price goes too low, they take allowances off the bid, off the auction. If it's too high, they add allowances to get the price down. Well, that used to work fairly well. We stayed within this range, which is, by the way, if you're going to have a free market bid, you don't put caps, you don't put limits on the prices. But what's happened recently, this year, 2024, the average price should have been $16 an allowance. It got up to at 1.27. So their process, their methodology has collapsed. Reggie no longer has control of the price of these things. So who knows where they're going to go. But that's why, so we don't actually need to build immediately more plants. We just need to let our plants operate in a free market. Get rid of the carbon tax.
That's an incredible, shocking conclusion or proposal.
Yeah.
I don't know why we would ever want to do that.
Right.
So,
Well, because the state gets the money.
Interesting.
But
So,
I mean, it's okay that big companies like these energy producers, have to pay these taxes. It's not like they pass that off to the
Oh,
citizens
no, it
of
doesn't
Delaware.
show up
they're
in
paying,
your...
yeah, no.
paying their fair share.
Like I think last year my gas bill to heat my house doubled. I
Right.
don't know if anybody else experienced that.
Have you been playing with your thermostat?
I'm always 30%, 28 to 30%. I get those little letters in the mail. More efficient than my neighbors' houses. Still,
go.
yeah, still
Nice job.
doubling. Yeah.
So I want to talk about nuclear because you touched on that, but let's try and connect a couple dots here before we take that step. And it's a little bit of what Rob was saying, and let's make sure we state this in a factual way that talks about what we're dealing with here in the first state. So there's science that says that maybe the climate isn't changing, and or if the climate's changing, it's not caused by human activity. It could be regular cycles that you're talking about that happen over decades and centuries.
And we're not talking pollution. Pollution is completely different.
That is
Plastic
correct.
in the oceans.
That
and
is
whatnot.
correct. Yeah. Everybody wants clean air and water.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's, I think, non-debatable.
And we're there.
Yeah. You brought up that point as well about how clean our air is, and it's going to get even cleaner as older cars retire. Okay. So there's science that's indicating that the changes in the environment are not necessarily human-made. However, the Delaware government has said, yes, they are, and we are in a climate crisis. Is that fair to say?
Correct. That is exactly what's being said.
Yes.
And in order to deal with that, the Delaware government has passed laws that say we need to get our power less carbon intensive. And they've had these laws on the books for 20 years, and it has changed our power mix close to none.
Correct.
Even though it has significantly increased the cost for every single energy user, whether you're a home or a business.
Correct.
And all of that money
Good summary.
is going to the state. And in order to comply with these laws, we are shutting down reliable sources of energy, Indian River plant, other facilities that you talked about out of state that aren't being used as much. Natural gas facilities aren't being used as much as they could be. So this is increasing the cost for everybody. It is reducing our reliability, and it is sending us down a potential path around solar and wind that will even further increase our costs and further reduce our reliability.
And we suspect that the unstated motive behind these initiatives of the government is to change our behavior with energy, which will have a direct negative impact on quality of life.
And
yes.
even if you like, let's say that point's up for debate, right?
Sure.
Maybe it's just people making decisions based on the moment rather than maybe a long-term view.
Or they don't really understand the limitations
exactly.
of the technologies.
Right. But we're heading Delaware down a path that is going to be incredibly expensive. We're talking about hundreds of millions or billions of dollars worth of investments in wind turbines or potential battery storage or whatever, investments over the next decade or so that will make Delaware a more expensive place to live, a more expensive place to run a business, less attractive to incoming businesses or people moving here.
30% of our population struggles with utility bills. 10% struggles seriously about whether they have to make a decision. Are they buying food? Are they paying their utility bill?
30% of Delaware's population.
30% are struggling.
Right.
10% are, it's really dire.
Wow. And yet the solutions to some of these are pretty simple because it's like just repeal the law that is requiring a lot of these taxes, extra costs, reduced usage of these facilities.
Let the market work, because the U.S. has reduced carbon dioxide emissions on a tonnage basis more than the entire European Union.
And
Sorry.
you provided an excellent summary of all that to help it put all the points together. This is where I wanted to talk about Germany real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
Germany has been the economic engine of Europe since after the Depression. And they have always been the dominant power for production in Europe. They now have some of the highest energy costs in Europe because they have relied heavily on solar, heavily on wind. And they shut down all their nuclear power plants. And then once the Ukraine war started and they weren't able to purchase cheap gas from Russia, they now are in a economic turmoil, and they are now suffering tremendously. The government's going to collapse. Unemployment is high. They're not producing anything, and they have become one of the poorer nations in Europe as a result.
Volkswagen just laid off, I think it was 30,000 employees.
Yeah, it's amazing. Correct. Yeah.
And that is due to the cost of energy and their ability to compete on a global market.
It is,
basically.
their energy is electricity is 3 times the expense of Delaware.
Yeah.
And my mother is a German immigrant. Half my family lives there, and I can attest to that. They are feeling the pain at the commoner level, we'll call it.
So before we get to what else can we do, because you gave a great suggestion, can we talk about California just a little bit? Is that okay? Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So California is suffering these wildfires, and of course everything you hear, this is because of climate change.
It's due to crappy land management, forest management practices.
Yes.
For part of it.
Part of it.
And part of it is allowing construction in the middle of forested areas that shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah.
You've got tree density in some of these forests. If you go back to times before things started, there is a natural tree density, particularly in a dry spot like California, where you might have 40 trees per acre is safe. And then every once in a while you get a lightning strike and you burn out the underbrush, and the bark on these trees was thick enough that they survive it. So the big trees manage to survive and they keep going. But now you're looking at situations where the tree density is up to several hundred per acre instead of 40 or 50. So now when you get a forest fire, and you haven't been able to do controlled burns to take out the brush,
Right.
you now get these intense fires, which are extremely hot. And then you get the wind blowing and you get these blasts of fire that just can't be stopped.
Right. And what's the water issue? Why are they having issues with water? Because they're saying that hydrants, there's no water.
Yeah, well, last year was a very wet year for California. They've had
Was.
they had a bunch of dry years,
Yeah.
but they had a really wet one last year. They were having flooding, but California refuses to build the reservoirs that are necessary to keep water going.
Yeah.
And that is specifically lawsuits from environmental groups like the NRDC, which stops any dams from being built. They use as an excuse, there's one called the snail darter, which there are different varieties. So there's one that's just, DNA is just microscopically different than the same animal that's very prevalent. But in this one location, they got this one that's not as prevalent. So they will use that to stop dam production. And without the dams, you don't have reservoirs. Without the reservoirs, you don't have water when you need it.
Yeah.
And every year, there is more water in Northern California than there is in Southern. So instead of building this stupid railway to nowhere that they're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, they should be putting up a dam and a pipeline from all the snow in Northern California when it melts and capturing that so it's available for Southern California.
Yeah.
I wonder if some of that is the same motive that I alluded to earlier, where they're purposely trying to change people's lifestyles.
I'm not sure what the lifestyle that would change because of that. Maybe you have less houses being built or
Yeah.
lower the population density.
Which sounds like it. Like you find the excuse, for this little what'd you call it? It was a
Snail darter.
snail darter. And you're looking for that so that you don't build the reservoir that will benefit a bunch of people. And I mean, Senator Hansen brought that up about the salamander, I think, in Glasgow Park. But
Yeah,
I think we all agree that was we enjoy the benefit of that.
Yeah.
And I alluded to then, or I mentioned that sometimes you can use that same sort of environmental loophole to block really beneficial projects and this sounds like an example of one of them.
On the other hand, I'll speak for some of my friends in the West who are more involved in this. The Caesar Rodney Institute is part of the state policy network. We have a group like ours in every state, and some of the states have more than one. But the ones in the West have more of these problems than we do here. But one of the things that it's pointed out is we have, I don't know the exact number of endangered species, but I think it's in the thousands. We've only recovered about one or two. Just a handful have ever been recovered because we don't spend any time on recovering endangered species. A project was done in one of the Dakotas where there was a fish that was a problem, and they set up hatcheries and they actually recovered the species, took it off the Endangered Species Act. But at this point, it seems like we are more using the Endangered Species Act for legal purposes rather than for environmental issues. Go down, since I'm from Sussex County, I'll bring this up. So there is a type of squirrel that was rare and became endangered in Maryland. That squirrel did not exist in Delaware. They imported that squirrel to the forest in Delaware, and then used that as a reason. Demrick used it as a reason why farmers couldn't do certain things because this imported endangered species was impacted. So you can abuse almost anything. One of the problems with progressivism is the idea that government experts know everything, and we do not. So, the free market can't possibly take care of anything.
So
Well, so you were talking about California, right? And they've had these devastating fires, and we're recording this on January 8th, right? Just to put a timestamp on it, and the scenes out of L.A. are horrendous.
they are.
Yeah, Malibu
Right.
is basically getting burnt down.
Yeah.
I think we want to tie that back a little bit as a data point to like what we were talking about here in terms of climate change. So I got to believe a fire puts out a little bit of carbon.
One year like this might wipe out several years of all the things California has done to try to reduce carbon dioxide. Microsoft bought, I forget the exact amount, I think it was about 100,000 acres in California of forest. And they were saying, every year the trees grow and they absorb, I think bigger trees can absorb like half a ton a year in growth. The entire 100,000 acres burnt down.
Yeah.
So what happened to the claimed Microsoft savings of CO2 when the entire forest went up?
Right.
And that's exactly what's happening.
So where do we go from here?
First of all, we started having some common sense. As we've said, as we've discussed here, if there is a climate change problem because of carbon dioxide, it is happening at such a slow rate, we have time to do things intelligently. If we're going to say in Delaware, offshore wind is going to save us, if we were to start, I know there was a bill passed last year to force utilities to go to an auction to buy offshore wind. If that actually happened, which it won't because the offshore wind developers actually said there's a price cap and none of us will bid. But anyway, let's say it happened and we did it this year. It would probably be somewhere around 2033 to 35 before that ever turned on. I can guarantee you there will be nuclear power plants by then available.
Yeah.
And sooner, because what you're seeing is right now, 3 Mile Island had 3 different units. One was damaged at one point and shut down. The other 2 kept operating. They just closed the last one about a year and a half ago. It's being restarted. I was actually consulting on a project up in Michigan. Michigan closed a nuclear plant 2 years ago, which I recommended they didn't, that they did anyway. And that plant is being restarted at a cost of $2 billion, which they would not have had to spend had they just left the darn thing alone.
Yeah.
There's another nuclear recovery going on in another location. And you've got people now start, for example, Bill Gates has a innovative design for a nuclear reactor. He's not waiting for the NRC. He's beginning to do the construction in a factory. The portion of it is done in the factory, betting on that it's going to get approved by the NRC. Last year, bless Tom Carper's heart, he led a Senate effort which passed something like 87 to 13, called the Advance Act. The idea of it is to speed NRC permitting, dramatically increase permitting process. And also got through the House, and then President Biden signed it in July. So we're seeing that kind of thing happen. We're seeing the reopening of, for example, Through My Island is, I think it was Microsoft.
Yeah, it's Microsoft.
Who wanted low CO2 power, and you're going to see a lot of that going on. It's just multiplying.
Right.
And what we're particularly seeing that's so powerful is it's the young folks, the younger generations do not have the fear of nuclear that some of us that went through earlier situations have. So we're not seeing the objections. So the other piece is, you'll still hear from the Sierra Club that, well, we can't do nuclear because there's nuclear waste. Well, in that Advance Act that Senator Carper passed, I was able, working with a friend who works in the nuclear industry in Annapolis, we got an amendment added. Now, maybe some of you have seen these breakfast clubs. You go to the McDonald's and there's 10 guys sitting around. They meet there every Tuesday. Well, in Houston, there's a breakfast club that's a bunch of retired Apollo scientists and retired nuclear engineers. And they noodled out a solution to the nuclear waste problem. And it turns out at the same time, the Idaho National Laboratory, which is a lesser known lab, was doing some tests on the same things. So what you do is you take the nuclear fuel rods that are existing, break them apart, reconstitute the uranium and such that are in there, and put them in a silicon oxide instead of a steel container, a rod. And instead of operating at 700 degrees C, you operate at 2,000 degrees C with a special reactor, and you can consume the energy that's in those rods. There is enough energy in our current waste pile to power the entire U.S. electric grid for 100 years.
Wow.
Does our nuclear engineer, have you heard of this?
From talking to Dave in past conversations,
Right.
yes, but this is
So, as I
that's
said,
beyond my understanding.
yeah.
But I'll say, yeah, it sounds good. Sounds
Nuclear operator might
yeah,
be a better. Yeah.
operator.
And the other key thing is right now with the plutonium in the waste, you've got to keep that secure for thousands and thousands of years. At 2,000 degrees C, you actually consume the plutonium, so it's no longer there.
McDonald's think tanks.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love this.
So what you wind up with is you only need to protect. You're going to wind up with about 5% of the current waste left, and it's only going to have to be secure for about 200 years. And this is the federal government talking, not me.
Right.
So, so we have an answer to the nuclear waste problem. The first part of it has been approved. There's a company called General Atomics. We've worked with two brothers. It's a private company that makes nuclear generating. They said they could have a prototype reactor assembled in 2 years.
Yeah.
So what we're hearing is there's alternatives to the alternatives.
There are.
So instead of solar and wind, which have a lot of really significant limitations, we talked about in the beginning, new uses for the carbon dioxide that comes off of the existing power plants, natural gas and coal. We can capture that, use that like the Rockefellers did with the gasoline that they used to dump off the waste product, which is now a useful resource. Nuclear, there's improvements to the nuclear waste that was everybody's concern coming out of that. You got to store it for 50,000 years. Now it sounds like 200 years. And we're not talking semi-fulls every day. It's not train cars full of nuclear waste like you see with coal. I mean,
The entire pile of nuclear waste would sit on a football field 40 feet high.
and you've got to have some land.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I'd say even before we got to that point, maybe to frame up the nuclear discussion, right? You talked about small modular reactors. You know, people here in Delaware, they can look across the river over to Jersey, and you see the Salem and Hope Creek. I'll say traditional style nuclear reactors. They still have, I don't know, 20 or 40 years on their operating license, but that's kind of the type of reactor that most people have experienced across the United States. They're massive, right? They take 500 plus acres. There's huge infrastructure around them. The cooling tower is 500 feet tall. But they produce a lot of energy. Those over there, about 2.5 gigawatts, I think, all told. 3 reactors over there. We haven't built any of those in the U.S. until recently. They just commissioned 2 more in Georgia for the first time in 30 years, I think, 40 years, something like that. It's been a long time when you build for the U.S. to build reactors on that scale. When you talk about small modular reactors, can you give people an idea of like how big we're talking?
You can fit them on a flatbed truck or a flat rail car.
Yeah.
And they produce.
They're going to be smaller. So you mentioned 2,000 megawatts at Salem River. You're going to build these anywhere from 10 to 250 megawatts. The Indian River Power Plant, for example, is 410 megawatts of coal plant. So they're much smaller. They're built in a factory, which takes out a lot of the weather-related and planning-related problems when you, like the 2 reactors, Vogtle reactors in Georgia, they were unique designs and unique built on site.
Correct.
So the cost went from an estimated $16 billion to $30 billion or something like that.
Astronomical.
So when you do all that, but this is going to be done in a factory and shipped in. you basically you build a 100-foot deep concrete silo. You put this at the bottom of the silo. You have a tank of cold water to cool it if there's a problem, which is gravity fed, which was the problem in Japan at Fukushima. It required electricity to open the valves to get the cooling water.
And Chernobyl, very similar.
Very similar, and Chernobyl had no protection around it at all. These, because they're smaller, they're inherently safer. The mass of uranium that goes in a big reactor is harder to cool down. You rarely hear of a problem with a small reactor. So you mentioned Salem River. The evacuation zone for that in an emergency is 14 miles. So
Correct.
It goes over to almost to Wilmington. We had, the governor had his Energy Advisory Council meetings. We had Catherine Huff came down from D.C., or did over Zoom. She is pushing small modular reactors, and her description was, we're looking at 300 closed coal plants to put these at, because you've already got transmission lines built and you've got trained people who ran them. Because these reactors are so safe, instead of a 14-mile evacuation zone, the evacuation zones ends at the fence line of the power plant.
Yeah. Since I do emergency management work, the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program, REP program, that's what comes in. It's paid for by the nuclear industry, but FEMA operates it. They have the evacuation zones. There's a lot of money and planning that goes into supporting all the communities that could be impacted. There's literally no footprint past the property.
Right, exactly.
And you look at something like that type of solution, and you look at a state like Delaware where we have lots of open land and we have lots of water.
Yeah.
Right. And our population's kind of distributed, small state, small population, but it's still, you can kind of see these population centers of Wilmington and Newark and then Middletown and Dover and then the beaches.
And we have a closing power plant in Millsboro
About that.
Yep.
Right
with
there.
existing transmission lines.
Yep.
This is really smelling like a common sense solution to this
seems like
problem, rather than
is.
building offshore windmills and
Yeah.
thousands of acres of solar panels. Just a mini reactor
Yep.
or a micro reactor.
Yeah. Or even if you had to do a couple of them up and down the state,
Sure.
based on the size, right? Reliability and all that. But
If we built 3 250 megawatt nuclear reactors, we would stop importing power from out of state.
Chris, you mentioned earlier that the state of Delaware has been collecting a lot of money for these green initiatives, these green power. Where's that money right now? What is it doing?
Yeah.
yeah, Dave can add to this as well. But right now, the state is collecting that. They're trying to figure out what to do with it.
So they have money.
They have. I think it's a couple $100 million at this point. I think 240 was the last. 240 was the last number I'd heard. Somewhere around there.
So 2/3 of the money goes to the Sustainable Energy Utility, which is a private nonprofit funded by the state. So they have, as of last year, I haven't got this year's numbers because I actually take it from their records. I don't make these up. They had received $150 million from the state over about a decade, and they still had $145 million in assets.
Yeah.
That would be a good kickstart.
And we can't. I have not been able to get DENREC. Won't tell how much they're sitting on. But a couple of years ago, it was 10 or 15 million.
But they try to find ways to spend that money, and
Yeah.
so they do things like subsidize solar panels.
Right.
They pay for installing electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. They do weatherization of homes and things like that. All well-intentioned, but at the same time, like a more conscious investment to say, why don't we shift what our energy production is? Why don't we invest in that long-term future?
Right.
Imagine where we would be if we had done that 20 years ago.
Exactly.
So is there anything that our friends staring at the TV, the monitor, listening?
Sorry to be so dense with all this, but it literally is. You need this kind of detail. Let me go back real quick.
Sure.
We talked about you mislabeled me as a doctor.
Yes.
Malcolm Gladwell wrote the book Outliers a number of years ago, and came up with the idea that it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert.
Right.
For me, that was 4 hours. I'm 4 years. I'm into 12 years now. So I know all this stuff, and it's great to have somebody ask me.
So yeah, what can people do? I mean, contact our or elected representatives, of course.
Really?
And maybe we can just give them some talking points. And of course, verify everything that we're saying here.
Absolutely.
Google search, ChatGPT, whatever you would like. Just make sure you got reputable sources, because there is a lot of incentive, as we discussed in a previous podcast, to push a narrative on this subject that leads to the types of policies and programs that we are seeing being pushed here in Delaware with the solar, the windmills. So we mentioned a couple resources. We'll link them in the description on this video that we'll put out there that have the counter narrative, we'll say, so you can do your own research, and I highly encourage everybody to do that. But what are some things that you would encourage them to look at and to do to help?
I'll be putting out a article next week about just reinforcing what we've been doing has failed. It's as simple as that. Mandates for wind and solar have failed. Electric vehicle mandates are going to fail, and doubly so because now the federal government's going to walk away from this and walk away from a lot of the subsidies. So we need to simply repeal some of these bills, but starting with the carbon tax, which is the absolute most damaging that we're doing right now. And then we've got to let industry. We know we have a problem with going down. I mean, literally, in 2 years, we could be having blackouts, serious blackouts. People die in blackouts. We need to give some space for the industry to do the right things. A lot of the problems we have in Delaware would go away if we simply remove the carbon tax and our power plants can produce power. But we need to stop adding new bills because Senator Hansen, bless her heart, as the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, keeps coming. She's going to have three more bills this year probably. We need to stop and take a pause and figure out where we want to go. There are. I'm very encouraged and by our new governor, Matt Meyer. I think he may be willing to take a different path. And that path needs to be, how can we encourage nuclear development in this state? That, in long term, if, let's say that we're absolutely crazy, that climate change is real, and we want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, we also want reliable power. Nuclear power plants operate 95% of the time. And this, actually, these new reactors will probably have to be fueled less often, so they'll have even higher capacity factors. So we need to move to nuclear, and we need to cancel what we've been doing.
And the amount of pollution fits into a football field size space.
Correct.
So with zero impact on the environment, obviously, unless something happens. But sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say, Rob, what I would add to your point about what people can do is go educate yourself about your power bill. Go pull it up online, pull out the bill you got in the mail, take a look at it, and look at what those additional charges are on there. You'll also find another one from another company up in Newark, which is Bloom Energy. The state said we have to buy their stuff. We have to subsidize it. We've been paying extra money on everybody's power bill for over a decade. So there's an example of decisions made at the state level, how they're impacting you on a daily basis, monthly basis for decades with little to no result as a result of it.
That one project will cost electric customers $1 billion over 20 years. Over 20 years.
All right, well, we've been going at this for an hour and 50 minutes, it looks like, and Jim is screaming that he has to make a call. It's important, so I think we have covered a lot of topics. We can wrap this up. We'd love to have you back again. So
I would love to come back.
And Dave, thanks for making the drive.
Yes.
Thanks for giving us your time. Thanks for sharing your expertise. This has been fantastic.
Yep. All right.
Jim, you didn't get to talk nearly as much this time. Sorry.
Oh
about
man,
that.
you guys do good. Good job getting in there. So, all right.
Appreciate
Well,
it.
Team effort.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you.
great to talk to all the folks, and I hope it's been instructive, and I hope I didn't put all of you to sleep.
No,
I was
no,
highly
I think so.
engaged,
Yeah.
so I'm sure everybody else was as well. So
Absolutely.
Into first with Dave Stevenson. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right.
See you, everybody.
And how come this is beer?